Welcome to another edition of RCE. This is Brock Palen. You can find us online at rce-cast.com. There's an RSS feed, and you can follow our Twitter feeds on there too. I again have Jeff Squyres from Cisco Systems and the OpenMPI project. Jeff, thanks again.
Hey, Brock. Good morning. Good morning for you, at least. Good morning for me. And it's a good night for our guests. They're literally on the other side of the world for us, and we very much appreciate them coming on what I think is about 10 o'clock at night for them and 8 o'clock in the morning for us. So, Brock, why don't you give us an introduction here?
So our guest today is Ken McDonell, who is actually located in Melbourne, Australia. And Ken is our first retired person who is working on this project for the love of it. So this is a first time for us.
Which I think is awesome. Ken, why don't you give us an introduction?
Thanks very much, Jeff and Brock. It's a pleasure to be here. The hour is not quite as uncivilized as some of the calls that I've had to take over the years. My name is Ken McDonell. I've been a computer scientist for about 42 years. My earliest programming exposure was in Fortran 2 as a part of a numerical methods course at university. I guess that was an early precursor to the field that's become known as HPC, and probably was my last piece of HPC-like code that I ever wrote. So I'm not an expert in HPC, but I have helped people in the HPC space deliver effective solutions and manage large and complex systems running HPC codes over many years. My main interest in computer science has been in performance analysis. I've been doing that for about 40 years of the 42 years that I've been a computer scientist. I've been using Unix and more lately Linux on a daily basis for about 37 years. And the Performance Copilot, the particular project we're going to talk about today, is something that I've been engaged with for about 18 years. So given all of that history, you can understand why I am now retired. And I enjoy grandchildren, gardening, cinema, travel, some recreational computing, which is mostly PCP development, and a small amount of technology-based consulting. Prior to being retired, I worked for 11 years as an academic, and I worked in engineering and engineering management roles for Pyramid Technology, Silicon Graphics, and a Melbourne-based company, Aconex.
So I need clarification on something. Fortran 2, did that involve punch cards?
If you were lucky, you got to use punch cards. If you were not that lucky, you got to use paper tape.
That is fabulous. Wow. I feel so inadequate here.
Yes, the first programs I created were punched by my own fair hand on punched cards.
Okay, so you mentioned Performance Copilot, which is the tool we're going to be speaking about today. So can you give us a quick rundown on what Performance Copilot is?
Sure. Performance Copilot, or PCP is the acronym we've come to know it by, is a collection of libraries, services, and packaged applications that's really designed for monitoring and managing the performance of complex systems. The focus is on systems level performance, and from our view, that spans the entire stack of contributing components. So from the hardware through the operating system and drivers, into the libraries and the layered services, and then out into application space, and then distributed applications running on potentially multiple machines in a distributed application. Architecturally, there's a number of bits of PCP that are similar to other performance management frameworks and some that are different. It has a client-server architecture, or a producer and consumer architecture, so some bits of the code produce performance data and other bits consume it and process it. It has a plug-in architecture and libraries that allow new sources of performance data to be easily added into the framework, so there's no fixed collection of data. It depends on the platform and the applications that are running on it. There's a single API that can be used for the applications that are consuming the performance data to process both real-time and historical data. So this is a really important differentiator, that we can look at not only today's activity, but compare that with yesterday or the day before. And then there's the whole thing is a distributed architecture. So even though the concept of clustered grid and cloud computing didn't exist as computing paradigms when PCP started, the framework is already well positioned to be able to support the full spectrum of platforms and architectures that are used for complex computation. And really we were trying to automate the mundane parts of performance management and use people to handle the exceptions. So that's where the Copilot piece comes in from the name. It borrows from the avionics concept that modern aircraft are very hard for humans to fly and they need assistance. The same is true of performance management in current systems.
So this is an 18-year-old project, if I recall, you said right there in the beginning. Give us a little bit of the evolution. So what were you doing back in paper tape days and punch card days that was critical for performance analysis?
In punch card days, we weren't doing very much. It was a little bit later that when we started to talk about file systems and information management systems in the days before databases, that we still had performance problems, even in the file system. But the PCP genesis really came quite a bit later in 1992 when I was working at Pyramid Technology, and we were grappling with a bunch of performance problems that were being observed in early symmetric multiprocessor Unix systems. These were systems with relatively small CPU counts, 4 to 12 nodes. But already the operating system issues were getting to be really quite complex in the area of cache effectiveness, VM and paging behavior, buffer and metadata management in the file system, networking in all the components of the networking, scheduler, oddness, context switch storms. All of these things were becoming much more complex, and the conventional tools up to that point, things like SAR and VMstat, some of which still exist today and are older than PCP, just were not giving us the insight we needed. So the idea started at Pyramid, but there was no development at Pyramid. It wasn't until we moved to SGI that in 1993 we began building PCP for the IRIX operating system, and the first product was released as an add-on SGI product in March 1995. Then there's a whole history of various pieces of porting of the code to different platforms for a whole variety of different reasons. Some were skunkwork projects, some were for single customers, some were part of SGI products that ran on more than just the IRIX operating system. So we grappled with portability quite early on, endian issues, a whole lot of things like that. Then SGI embraced open source, and the PCP components were first released as open source in September of 1999. And then over the following 10 years, there have been additional releases of more and more of the pieces, and almost all of the original proprietary code has now been open sourced by SGI. And I should take a moment just to thank SGI. There was a good strategic reason for doing it at the time, but SGI has continued to support the project and been very responsive to our requests to have additional components placed in the open source. So much of what we see today is really as a result of SGI playing a good open source community member in that role. PCP has become included in major Linux distributions, knocking on from that open source work. It went into SUSE in 2003, Red Hat in 2007, Ubuntu in 2009, which was really a flow-on from an earlier inclusion in Debian. It's an active open source project now with regular releases on both a major and minor schedule.
So there's a lot of history behind this thing, and it's done some different things. So if I'm going to use PCP, what's it look like? You mentioned it's a client-server setup. What would I look to when trying to get performance information for my application?
The first thing would be to